had you there for a minute, didn't I? My dear friend Watson said you might be dropping by this evening. He said you are interested in some of my cases. As you know, Dr. Watson has been my chronicler for many years now. And although his narratives are sensational and populist, and frequently fail to accurately and objectively report the science of my craft, yet it is through his prism that you've come to know my work. Therefore, this evening, I will retell two stories as he told them in the Strand magazine. I shall endeavor to live up to his imaginative prose. The Man with the Twisted Lip. Isa Whitney, brother of the late Elias Whitney, D.D., principal of the Theological College at St. George's, was much addicted to opium. The habit grew upon him, as I understand, from some foolish freak while he was at college. For having read De Quincey's description of his dreams and sensations, he had drenched his tobacco with laudanum in an attempt to produce the same effects. He found, as so many more have done, that the practice is easier to attain than to get rid of. And for many years, he continued to be a slave to the drug, an object of mingled horror and pity to his friends and relatives. I can see him now, with yellow, pasty face, drooping lids and pinpoint pupils, all huddled in a chair, the wreck and ruin of a noble man. One night, it was June '89, there came a ring to my bell, about the hour when a man gives his first yawn and glances at the clock. I sat up in my chair, and my wife laid her needlework down in her lap and made a little face of disappointment. "A patient?" said she. "You'll have to go out." I groaned, for I was newly come back from a weary day. We heard the door open, a few hurried words, and then quick steps upon the linoleum. Our own door flew open, and a lady clad in some dark-colored stuff with a black veil entered the room. "You will excuse me for calling so late," she began. And then suddenly, losing her self-control, she ran forward, threw her arms around my wife's neck, and sobbed upon her shoulders. "Oh, I'm in such trouble," she cried. "I do so want a little help." "Why," said my wife, pulling up her veil, "it's Kate Whitney. How you startled me, Kate. I had not an idea of who you were when you came in. I didn't know what to do, so I came straight to you." That was always the way. Folk who were in grief came to my wife like birds to a lighthouse. "It was very sweet of you to come. Now you must have some wine and water and sit here comfortably and tell us all about it. Or should you rather that I send James off to bed?" "Oh, no. No, I want the doctor's advice and help, too. It's about Isa. He's not been home for 2 days, and I am so frightened about him." It was not the first time that she had spoken to us of her husband's trouble, to me as a doctor, to my wife as an old friend and school companion. We soothed and comforted her by such words as we could find. Did she know who her husband was? Was it possible that we could bring him back to her? It seems that it was. She had the surest information that of late, when the fit was on him, he had made use of an opium den in the farthest east of the city. Hitherto, his orgies had always been confined to one day, and he had come back twitching and shattered in the evening. But now the fit had been upon him for 48 hours, and he lay there, doubtless among the dregs of the docks, breathing in the poison or sleeping off its effects. There he was to be found, she was sure of it, in the Bar of Gold in Upper Swandam Lane. But what was she to do? How could she, a young and timid woman, make her way into such a place and pluck her husband from among the ruffians who surrounded him? There was the case, and of course there was only one way out of it. Might not I escort her to this place? And then, as a second thought, why should she come at all? I was Isa Whitney's medical advisor, and as such, I had influence over him. I could manage it better if I were alone. I promised her on my word that I would send him home in a cab within 2 hours if he were indeed at the address which he had given me. And so, in 10 minutes, I had left my armchair and cheery sitting room behind me and was speeding eastward in a hansom, on a strange errand, as it seemed to me, though the future could only show how strange it was to be. But there was no great difficulty in the first stage of my adventure. Upper Swandam Lane is a vile alley lurking between the high wharves which line the north side of the river to the east of London Bridge, between a slop shop and a gin shop, approached by a steep flight of stairs leading down to a black gap like the mouth of a cave. I found the den of which I was in search, ordering my cab to wait. I passed down the steps, worn hollow in the center by the ceaseless tread of drunken feet, and by the light of a flickering oil lamp above the door, I found the latch and made my way into a large, low room, thick and heavy with the brown opium smoke, and terraced with wooden berths, like the forecastle of an immigrant ship. Through the gloom, one could dimly catch a glimpse of bodies lying in strange, fantastic poses, bowed shoulders, bent knees, heads thrown back and chins pointing upward, with here and there a dark, lackluster eye turned upon the newcomer. Out of the black shadows there glimmered little red circles of light, now bright, now faint, as the burning poison waxed or waned in the metal pipes. The most lay silent, but some muttered to themselves, and others talked together in a strange, low, monotonous voice, the conversation coming in gushes and then suddenly tailing off into silence, each mumbling out his own thoughts and paying little heed to the words of his neighbor. At the farther end was a small brazier of burning charcoal, beside which, on a three-legged stool, there sat a tall, thin old man, with his jaws resting upon his fists and his elbows upon his knees, staring into the fire. As I entered, a sallow Malay attendant had hurried up with a pipe for me and a supply of the drug, beckoning me to an empty berth. "Thank you, I have not come to stay," said I. "There is a friend of mine here, Mr. Isa Whitney, and I wish to speak with him." There was a movement and an exclamation from my right, and peering through the gloom, I saw Whitney, pale, haggard, and unkempt, staring out at me. "My God, it's Watson," said he. He was in a pitiable state of reaction, with every nerve in a twitter. "I say, Watson, what o'clock is it?" "Nearly 11. "Of what day?" "Of Friday, June 19th. "Good heavens, I thought it was Wednesday." "It is Wednesday. What do you want to frighten a chap for?" He sank his face onto his arms and began to sob in a high treble key. "I tell you that it is Friday, man. Your wife has been waiting this 2 days for you. You should be ashamed of yourself." "So I am. But you've got mixed, Watson. For I've only been here a few hours, 3 pipes, 4 pipes. I forget how many. But I'll go home with you. I wouldn't frighten Kate. Poor little Kate. Give me your hand. Have you a cab?" "Yes, I have one waiting." "Then I shall go in it. But I must owe something. Find out what I owe, Watson. I am all off color, and I can do nothing for myself." I walked down the narrow passage between the double row of sleepers, holding my breath to keep out the vile, stupefying fumes of the drug, and looking about for the manager. As I passed the tall man who sat by the brazier, I felt a sudden pluck at my skirt, and a voice that said, "Look, walk past me, and then look back at me." The words fell quite distinctly upon my ear. I glanced down. They could only have come from the old man at my side, and yet he sat now as absorbed as ever, very thin, very wrinkled, bent with age, an opium pipe dangling down from between his knees, although it had dropped in sheer lassitude from his fingers. I took 2 steps forward and looked back. It took all my self-control to prevent from breaking out into a cry of astonishment. He had turned his back so that none could see him but I. His form had filled out. His wrinkles were gone. His dull eyes had regained their fire. And there, sitting by the fire and grinning at my surprise, was none other than Sherlock Holmes. He made a slight motion to me to approach him, and instantly, as he turned around to the company once more, subsided into a doddering, loose-lipped senility. "Holmes," I whispered, "what on earth are you doing in this den?" "As low as you can," he answered. "I have excellent ears. If you would have the great kindness to get rid of that sottish friend of yours, I should exceedingly be glad to have a little talk with you. I have a cab outside." "Then pray send him home in it. You may safely trust him, for he appears to be too limp to get into any mischief. I should recommend you also to send a note by the cabman to your wife to say that you have thrown in your lot with me. If you will wait outside, I shall be with you in 5 minutes." It was difficult to refuse any of Sherlock Holmes's requests, for they were always so exceedingly definite and put forward with such a quiet air of mastery. I felt, however, that when Whitney was once confined to the cab, my mission was practically accomplished. And for the rest, I could not wish anything better than to be associated with my friend in one of those singular adventures which were the normal condition of his existence. In a few minutes, I had written my note, paid Whitney's bill, led him out to the cab, and seen him driven through the darkness. In a very short time, a decrepit figure had emerged from the opium den, and I was walking down the street with Sherlock Holmes. For 2 streets, he shuffled along with a back bent and uncertain foot. Then, glancing quickly around, he straightened himself out and burst into a hearty fit of laughter. "I suppose, Watson," said he, "that you imagine that I've added opium smoking to cocaine injections and all the other little weaknesses on which you have favored me with your medical views. I was certainly surprised to find you there, but not more so than I to find you. I came to find a friend, and I to find an enemy." "An enemy?" "Yes, one of my natural enemies, or shall I say my natural prey. Briefly, Watson, I am in the midst of a very remarkable inquiry, and I have hoped to find a clue in the incoherent ramblings of these thoughts as I have done before now. Had I been recognized in that den, my life would not have been worth an hour's purchase, for I have used it before for my own purposes, and the rascally Lasker who runs it has sworn to have vengeance upon me. There is a trap door at the back of the building near the corner of Paul's Wharf, which could tell some strange tales of what has passed through it upon moonless nights." "What? You do not mean bodies?" "Aye, bodies, Watson. We should be rich men if we had £1,000 for every poor devil who has been done to death in that den. It is the vilest murder trap on the whole riverside, and I fear that Neville St. Clair has entered it, never to leave it more. But our trap should be here." He put his 2 forefingers together and whistled shrilly, a signal which was answered by a similar whistle from the distance, followed shortly by the rattle of wheels and the clink of horses' hooves. "Now, Watson," said Holmes, as a tall dog-cart dashed up through the gloom, throwing out 2 golden tunnels of yellow light from its side lanterns, "you'll come with me, won't you?" "If I can be of use." "Oh, a trusty comrade is always of use, and a chronicler still more. My room at the Cedars is a double-bedded one." "The Cedars?" "Yes, that is Mr. St. Clair's house. I am staying there while I conduct the inquiry." "Where is it, then?" "Near Lee, in Kent. We have a 7-mile drive before us." "But I am all in the dark." "Of course you are. You'll know all about it presently. Jump up." "All right, John, we shall not need you. Here's half a crown. Look out for me tomorrow at 11. Give her head. So long, then." He flicked the horse with his whip, and we dashed away through the endless succession of somber and deserted streets, which widened gradually until we were flying across a broad balustraded bridge with the murky river sluggishly beneath. Beyond lay another dull wilderness of bricks and mortar, its silence broken only by the heavy, regular footfalls of the policemen or the songs and shouts of some belated party of revelers. A dull rack was drifting slowly across the sky, and a star or 2 twinkled dimly here and there through the rifts of the clouds. Holmes drove in silence, with his head sunk upon his breast, and the air of a man who was lost in thought, while I sat beside him, curious to know what this new quest might be which seemed to tax his power so sorely, and yet afraid to break in upon the current of his thoughts. We had driven several miles and were beginning to get to the fringe of the belt of suburban villas, when he shook himself, shrugged his shoulders, and lit up his pipe with the air of a man who is satisfied that he is acting for the best. "You've a grand gift of silence, Watson," said he. "It makes you quite invaluable as a companion. Upon my word, it is a great thing for me to have someone to talk to, for my own thoughts are not over pleasant. I was wondering what I should say to this dear little woman tonight when she meets me at the door. You forget that I know nothing about it. I shall just have time to tell you about the facts of the case before we get to Lee. It seems absurdly simple, and yet somehow I can get nothing to go upon. There's plenty of thread, no doubt, but I can't seem to get the end of it into my hand. Now, I'll state the case clearly and concisely to you, Watson, and maybe you can see a spark where all is dark to me. Proceed then. Some years ago, to be definite, in May 1884, there came to Lee a gentleman, Neville St. Clair by name, who appeared to have plenty of money. He took a large villa, laid out the grounds very nicely, and lived generally in good style. By degrees, he made friends in the neighborhood, and in 1887, he married the daughter of a local brewer, by whom he now has 2 children. He had no occupation, but was interested in several companies, and went into town as a rule in the morning, returning by the 5:14 from Cannon Street every night. Mr. St. Clair is now 37 years of age. He's a man of temperate habits, a good husband, a very affectionate father, and a man who is popular with all who know him. I may add that his whole debts at the moment, as far as we've been able to ascertain, amount to £88 10s, while he has £220 standing to his credit in the Capital and Counties Bank. There is no reason, therefore, to think that money troubles have weighed upon his mind. Last Monday, Mr. Neville St. Clair went into town rather earlier than usual, remarking before he started that he had 2 important commissions to perform, and that he would bring his little boy home a box of bricks. Now, by the merest chance, his wife received a telegram upon that same Monday, very shortly after his departure, to the effect that a small parcel of considerable value, which she had been expecting, was waiting for her at the office of the Aberdeen Shipping Company. Now, if you are well up in your London, you will know that the office of the company is in Fresno Street, which branches out of Upper Swandam Lane, where you found me tonight. Mrs. St. Clair had her lunch, started for the city, did some shopping, proceeded to the company's office, got her packet, and found herself at exactly 4:35 walking through Swandam Lane on her way back to the station. Have you followed me so far? It is very clear. If you remember, Monday was an exceedingly hot day, and Mrs. St. Clair walked slowly, glancing about in the hopes of seeing a cab, as she did not like the neighborhood in which she found herself. While she was walking in this way down Swandam Lane, she suddenly heard an ejaculation or cry, and was struck cold to see her husband looking down at her, and, as it seemed to her, beckoning to her from a second-floor window. The window was open, and she distinctly saw his face, which she describes as being terribly agitated. The window was open, and she distinctly saw his face, which she describes as being terribly agitated. He waved his hands frantically to her, and then vanished from the window so suddenly that it seemed to her that he had been plucked back by some irresistible force. One singular point which struck her quick feminine eye was that although he wore some dark coat such as he had started to town in, he had on neither collar nor necktie. Convinced that something was amiss with him, she rushed down the steps, for the house was none other than the opium den in which you found me tonight. And running through the front room, she attempted to ascend the stairs which led to the first floor. At the foot of the stairs, however, she met this Lascar scoundrel of whom I have spoken, who thrust her back and, aided by a Dane who works as an assistant there, pushed her out into the street. Filled with the most maddening doubts and fears, she rushed down the lane and, by rare good fortune, met in Fresno Street a number of constables with an inspector, all on their way to their beat. The inspector and two men accompanied her back, and in spite of the continued resistance of the proprietor, they made their way to the room in which Mr. Neville St. Clair had last been seen. There was no sign of him there. In fact, in the whole of that floor, there was no one to be found save a crippled wretch of hideous aspect, who, it seems, made his home there. Both he and the Lascar stoutly swore that no one else had been there during the afternoon. So determined was their denial that the inspector was staggered and had almost come to believe that Mrs. Neville St. Clair had been deluded when, with a cry, she sprang at a small deal box which lay upon the table and tore the lid from it. Out there fell a cascade of children's bricks. It was the toy which he had promised to bring home. This discovery and the evident confusion which the cripple showed made the inspector realize that the matter was serious. The rooms were carefully examined, and all results pointed to an abominable crime. The front room was plainly furnished as a sitting room and led into a small bedroom which looked out upon the back of one of the wharves. Between the wharf and the bedroom window is a narrow strip, which is dry at low tide but is covered at high tide with at least 4.5 feet of water. The bedroom window was a broad one and opened from below. On examination, traces of blood were to be seen upon the windowsill, and several scattered drops were visible upon the wooden floor of the bedroom. Thrust away behind a curtain in the front room were all the clothes of Mr. Neville St. Clair, with the exception of his coat. His boots, his socks, and his watch, all were there. There were no signs of violence upon any of these garments, and there were no other traces of Mr. Neville St. Clair. Out of the window he must apparently have gone, for there was no other exit, and the ominous bloodstains upon the sill gave little promise that he could save himself by swimming, for the tide was at its very highest at the moment of the tragedy. And now, as to the villains who seemed to be immediately implicated in the matter. The Lascar was known to be a man of the vilest antecedents. But as by Mrs. St. Clair's story, he was known to have been at the foot of the stairs within a very few seconds of her husband's appearance at the window, he could hardly have been more than an accomplice to the crime. His defense was one of absolute ignorance, and he protested that he had no knowledge as to the doings of Hugh Boone, his lodger, and that he could not account in any way for the presence of the missing gentleman's clothes. So much for the Lascar manager. Now for the sinister cripple who lives upon the second floor of the opium den, and who is certainly the last human being whose eye is rested upon Neville St. Clair. His name is Hugh Boone, and his hideous face is one which is familiar to every man who goes much to the city. He is a professional beggar, though in order to avoid the public regulations, he pretends to a small trade in wax vestas. Some little distance down Threadneedle Street, upon the left-hand side, there is, as you may have remarked, a small angle in the wall. Here it is that this creature takes his daily seat, cross-legged with his tiny stock of matches on his lap, and, as he is a piteous spectacle, a small rain of charity descends into the greasy leather cap, which lies upon the pavement beside him. I have watched this fellow more than once before ever I thought of making his professional acquaintance, and I have been surprised at the harvest which he has reaped in a short time. His appearance, you see, is so remarkable that no one can pass him by without observing him. A shock of orange hair, a pale face disfigured by a horrible scar, which by its contraction has turned up the outer edge of his upper lip, a bulldog chin, all mark him out from among the common crowd of mendicants. And so too does his wit, for he is ever ready with a reply to any piece of chaff which may be thrown at him by passers-by. This is the man whom we now learn to have been the lodger at the opium den, and to have been the last man to see the gentleman of whom we are in quest. But a cripple, said I? What could he have done against a single man in the prime of his life? He is a cripple in the sense that he walks with a limp, but in other respects he appears to be a powerful and well-nurtured man. Surely your medical experience would tell you, Watson, that weakness in one limb is often made up for by exceptional strength in the others. Pray continue your narrative. Mrs. St. Clair had fainted at the sight of the blood upon the window, and she was escorted home in a cab by the police, as her presence could be of no help to them in their investigation. Inspector Barton, who had charge of the case, made a very careful examination of the premises, but without finding anything which threw any light upon the matter. One mistake had been made in not arresting Boone instantly, as he was allowed some few minutes during which he might have communicated with his friend, the Lascar. But this fault was soon remedied, and he was seized and searched, without anything being found which could incriminate him. There were, it is true, some bloodstains upon his right shirt sleeve, but he pointed to his ring finger, which had been cut near the nail, and explained that the bleeding came from there, adding that he had been to the window not long before, and that the stains which had been observed there came doubtless from the same source. He denied strenuously having ever seen Mr. Neville St. Clair, and swore that the presence of the clothes in his rooms were as much a mystery to him as to the police. As to Mrs. St. Clair's assertion that she had actually seen her husband at the window, he declared that she must have been either mad or dreaming. He was removed, loudly protesting, to the police station, while the inspector remained upon the premises in the hope that the ebbing tide might afford some fresh clue. And it did. Although they hardly found upon the mudbank what they had feared to find. It was Neville St. Clair's coat, and not Neville St. Clair, which lay uncovered as the tide receded. And what do you think they found in the pockets? I cannot imagine. No, I didn't think you would. Every pocket stuffed with pennies and halfpennies, 421 pennies and 270 halfpennies. It was no wonder that it had not been swept away by the tide, but a human body is a different thing. There is a fierce eddy between the wharf and the house. It seemed likely enough that the weighted coat had remained when the stripped body had been sucked away by the river. But I understand that all the other clothes were found in the room. Would the body be dressed in a coat alone? No, sir, but the facts might be met speciously enough. Suppose that this man, Boone, had thrust Neville St. Clair through the window. There's no human eye which could have seen the deed. What would he do then? It would, of course, instantly strike him that he must get rid of the telltale garments. He would seize the coat then and be in the act of throwing it out when it would occur to him that it would swim and not sink. He has little time, for he has heard the scuffle downstairs when the wife was forcing her way up, and perhaps he has already heard from his Lascar confederate that the police are hurrying up the street. There is not an instant to be lost. He rushes to some secret hoard where he has accumulated the fruits of his vagary, and he stuffs all the coins upon which he can lay his hands into the pockets to make sure of the coat's sinking. He throws it out, and would have done the same with the rest of the garments, had not he heard the rush of steps below, and only just had time to close the window when the police appeared. It certainly sounds feasible. Well, we will take it as a working hypothesis for want of a better. Boone, as I have told you, was arrested and taken to the station, but it could not be shown that there had ever been anything against him. He had for years been known as a professional beggar, but his life appeared to have been a very quiet and innocent one. There the matter stands at present, and the questions which have to be solved, what Neville St. Clair was doing in the opium den, what happened to him when he was there, where is he now, and what Hugh Boone had to do with his disappearance are all as far from a solution as ever. I confess that I cannot recall any case within my experience which first seemed so simple and yet which presented such difficulties. While Sherlock Holmes had been detailing this singular series of events, we had been whirling through the outskirts of the great town until the last straggling houses had been left behind, and we rattled along with a country hedge upon either side of us. Just as he had finished, however, we drove through two scattered villages where a few lights still glimmered in the windows. "We are on the outskirts of Lee," said my companion. "We have touched on 3 English counties in our short drive, starting in Middlesex, passing over an angle of Surrey, and ending in Kent. See that light among the trees? That is the Cedars, and beside that lamp sits a woman whose anxious ears have already, I have little doubt, caught the clink of our horses' feet." "But why are you not conducting the case from Baker Street?" I asked. "Because there are many inquiries which must be made out here. Mrs. St. Clair has most kindly put 2 rooms at my disposal, and you may rest assured that she will have nothing but a welcome from my friend and colleague. I hate to meet her, Watson, when I have no news of her husband. Here we are. Whoa there, whoa!" We had pulled up in front of a large villa which stood within its own grounds. A stable boy had run out to the horse's head, and springing down, I followed Holmes up the small, winding gravel drive which led to the house. As we approached, the door flew open, and a little blonde woman stood in the opening, clad in some sort of light mousseline de soie, with a touch of fluffy pink chiffon at her neck and wrists. She stood with her finger outlined against the flood of light, one hand upon the door, one half raised in her eagerness, her body slightly bent, her head and face protruded with eager eyes and parted lips, a standing question. "Well," she cried, "well?" And then, seeing that there were 2 of us, she gave a little cry of hope, which sank into a groan as she saw that my companion shook his head and shrugged his shoulders. "No good news?" "None." "No bad?" "No." "Thank God for that. But come in. You must be weary, for you have had a long day. This is my friend, Dr. Watson. He has been of most vital use to me in several of my cases, and a lucky chance has made it possible for me to bring him out and associate him with this investigation." "I am delighted to see you," said she, pressing my hand warmly. "You will, I am sure, forgive anything that may be wanting in our arrangements when you consider the blow which has so suddenly come upon us." "My dear madam," said I am an old campaigner, and if I were not, I can very well see that no apology is needed. If I can be of any assistance either to you or to my friend here, I shall indeed be happy." "Now, Mr. Sherlock Holmes," said the lady as we entered a well-lit dining room, upon the table of which a cold supper had been laid out, "I should very much like to ask you 1 or 2 plain questions to which I beg you will give a plain answer." "Certainly, madam." "Do not trouble about my feelings. I am not hysterical nor given to fainting. I simply wish to know your real opinion." "Upon what point? In your heart of hearts, do you think that Neville is alive?" Sherlock Holmes seemed to be embarrassed by the question. "Frankly now," she repeated, standing upon the rug and looking keenly down at him as he leaned back in a basket chair. "Frankly then, madam, I do not." "You think that he is dead?" "I do." "Murdered?" "I don't say that. Perhaps." "And on what day did he meet his death?" "On Monday." "Then perhaps, Mr. Holmes, you will be good enough to explain how it is that I received a letter from him today." "What?" he roared. "Yes, today." She stood smiling, holding up a little slip of paper in the air. "May I see it?" "Certainly." Smoothing it out upon the table, he drew over the lamp and examined it intently. I had left my chair and was looking at it over his shoulder. The envelope was a coarse one and was stamped with the Gravesend postmark, and with the date of that very day, or rather of the day before, for it was considerably after midnight. "Coarse writing," murmured Holmes. "Surely this is not your husband's writing, madam?" "No, but the enclosure is." "I perceive that whoever addressed the envelope had to go and inquire as to the address." "How can you tell that?" "The name. You see it is in perfectly black ink, which has dried itself. The rest is all of the grayish color, which shows that blotting paper has been used. If it had been written straight off and then blotted, none would be of a deep black shade. This man has written the name, and then there has been a pause before he wrote the address, which can only mean that he was not familiar with it. It is, of course, a trifle, but there is nothing so important as trifles. Let us now see the letter. There has been an enclosure here. Yes, there was a ring, his signet ring. And you are sure that this is your husband's hand? One of his hands? One? His hand when he wrote hurriedly. It is very unlike his usual writing, and yet I know it very well. Dearest, do not be frightened. All will come well. There is a huge error which may take some little time to rectify. Wait in patience. Neville. Written in pencil upon the flyleaf of a book, octavo size, no watermark. Posted today in Gravesend by a man with a dirty thumb. Ha! And the flap has been gummed, if I'm not very much in error, by a man who's chewing tobacco. And you have no doubt that this is your husband's hand, madam. None. Neville wrote those words. And they are posted today at Gravesend. Well, Mrs. St. Clair, the clouds lighten, though I should not venture to say that the danger is over. But he must be alive, Mr. Holmes. Unless this is a clever forgery to put us on the wrong scent. The ring, after all, proves nothing and may have been taken from him. No, it is his own writing. Very well. It may, however, have been written on Monday and only posted today. That is possible. If so, much may have happened between. Oh, you must not discourage me, Mr. Holmes. I know that all is well with him. There is so keen a sympathy between us that I should know if any evil had come upon him. On the very day that I saw him last, he cut himself in the bedroom, and yet I, in the dining room, rushed upstairs instantly with the utmost certainty that something had happened. Do you think that I would respond to such a trifle and yet be ignorant of his death? I have seen too much not to know that the impression of a woman may be more valuable than the conclusion of an analytical reasoner. And in this letter, you certainly have a very strong piece of evidence to corroborate your view. But if your husband is alive and able to write letters, why should he remain away from you? I cannot imagine. It is unthinkable. And on Monday, he made no remarks before leaving you? No. And you were surprised to see him in Swandam Lane? Very much so. Was the window open? Yes. Then he might have called to you. Yes. A call for help, you thought. Yes, he waved his hands. But it might have been a cry of surprise. Astonishment at the unexpected sight of you might have caused him to throw up his hands. It is possible. And you thought he was pulled back. He disappeared so suddenly. He might have leapt back. You did not see anyone else in the room. No, but this horrible man confessed to having been there, and the Lascar was at the foot of the stairs. Quite so. Your husband, as far as you could see, had his ordinary clothes on, but without his collar or tie. I distinctly saw his bare throat. Had he ever spoken of Swandam Lane? Never. Had he ever shown any signs of taking opium? Never. Thank you, Mrs. St. Clair. Those are the principal points about which I wish to be absolutely clear. We shall now have a little supper and then retire, for we may have a very busy day ahead of us tomorrow. A large and comfortable double-bedded room had been placed at our disposal, and I was quickly between the sheets, for I was weary after my night of adventure. Sherlock Holmes, however, was a man who, when he had an unsolved problem upon his mind, would go for days and even for a week without rest, turning it over, rearranging the facts, looking at it from every point of view, until he had either fathomed it or convinced himself that his data were insufficient. It was soon evident to me that he was now preparing for an all-night sitting. He took off his coat and waistcoat, put on a large blue dressing gown, and then wandered about the room collecting pillows from his bed and cushions from the sofa and armchairs. With these, he constructed a sort of Eastern divan, upon which he pushed himself, cross-legged, with an ounce of shag tobacco and a box of matches. In the dim light of the lamp, I saw him sitting there, an old briar pipe between his lips, his eyes fixed vacantly upon the corner of the ceiling, the blue smoke curling up from him, silent, motionless, with the light shining upon his strong-set, aquiline features. So he sat as I dropped off to sleep, and so he sat when a sudden ejaculation caused me to wake up, and I found the summer sun shining into the apartment. The pipe was still between his lips. The smoke still curled upwards, and the room was full of a dense tobacco haze, but nothing remained of the heap of shag which I had seen upon the previous night. "Awake, Watson?" "Yes." "Game for a drive, then?" "Certainly." "Then dress. No one is stirring yet, but I know where the stable boy sleeps, and we shall soon have the trap out." He chuckled to himself as he spoke. His eyes twinkled, and he seemed a different man from the somber thinker of the previous night. As I dressed, I glanced at my watch. It was no wonder that no one was stirring. It was 25 minutes past 4. I had hardly finished when Holmes returned with the news that the boy was putting in the horse. "I want to test a little theory of mine," said he, pulling on his boots. "I think, Watson, that you are now standing in the presence of one of the most absolute fools in Europe. I deserve to be kicked from here to Charing Cross. But I think I have the key of the affair now." "And where is it?" I asked, smiling. "In the bathroom," he answered. "Oh, yes, I'm not joking." He continued, seeing my look of incredulity. "I have just been there, and I've taken it out, and I've got it in this Gladstone bag. Come on, my boy, and we'll see whether it will fit the lock." We made our way downstairs as quietly as possible and out into the bright morning sunshine. In the road stood our horse and trap with the half-clad stable boy waiting at the head. We both sprang in, and away we dashed down the London road. A few country carts were stirring, bearing in vegetables to the metropolis, but the lines of villas on either side were as silent and lifeless as some city in a dream. "It has been in some points a singular case," said Holmes, flicking the horse into a gallop. "I confess that I've been as blind as a mole, but it is better to learn wisdom late than never to learn it at all." In town, the earliest risers were just beginning to look sleepily from their windows as we drove through the streets of the Surrey side. Passing down the Waterloo Bridge, we crossed over the river and, dashing up Wellington Street, wheeled sharply to the right and found ourselves in Bow Street. Sherlock Holmes was well known to the force, and the two constables at the door saluted him. One of them held the horse's head, while the other led us in. "Who is on duty?" asked Holmes. "Inspector Bradstreet, sir." "Ah, Bradstreet, how are you?" A tall, stout official had come down the stone-flagged passage in a peaked cap and frog jacket. "I wish to have a quiet word with you, Bradstreet." "Certainly, Mr. Holmes. Step into my room here." It was a small office-like room with a huge ledger upon the table and a telephone projecting from the wall. The inspector sat down at his desk. "What can I do for you, Mr. Holmes?" "I called about that beggar man, Boone, the one who was charged with being concerned in the disappearance of Mr. Never St. Clair of Lee." "Yes, he was brought up and remanded for further inquiries." "So I heard. You have him here? In the cells? Is he quiet?" "Oh, he gives no problem, but he is a dirty scoundrel." "Dirty?" "Yes, it is all we can do to make him wash his hands, and his face is as black as a tinker's. Well, once his case has been settled, he will have a regular prison bath, and I think if you saw him, you would agree that he needed it." I should like to see him very much. Would you? That is easily done. Come this way. You can leave your bag. No, I think I'll take it. Very good. Come this way, if you please. He led us down a passage, opened a barred door, passed down a winding stair, and brought us to a whitewashed corridor with a line of doors on each side. The third on the right is his, said the inspector. Here it is. He quietly shot back a panel in the upper part of the door and glanced through. He's asleep, said he. You can see him very well. We both put our eyes to the grating. The prisoner lay with his face toward us in a very deep sleep, breathing slowly and heavily. He was a middle-sized man, coarsely clad as became his calling, with a colored shirt protruding through the rent in his tattered coat. He was, as the inspector had said, extremely dirty, but the grime which covered his face could not conceal its repulsive ugliness. A broad wheal from an old scar ran right across it from eye to chin, and by its contraction had turned up one side of the upper lip, so that 3 teeth were exposed in a perpetual snarl. A shock of very bright red hair grew low over his eyes and forehead. He's a beauty, isn't he? Said the inspector. He certainly needs a wash, remarked Holmes. I had an idea that he might, and I took the liberty of bringing the tools with me. He opened the Gladstone bag as he spoke and took out, to my astonishment, a very large bath sponge. You are a funny one, chuckled the inspector. Now, if you will have the great goodness to open that door very quietly, we will soon make him cut a much more respectable figure. Well, I don't know why not, said the inspector. He doesn't look a credit to the Bow Street cells, does he? He slipped his key into the lock, and we all very quietly entered the cell. The sleeper half turned and then settled down once more into a deep slumber. Holmes stooped to the water jug, moistened his sponge, and then rubbed it twice vigorously across and down the prisoner's face. Let me introduce you to Mr. Neville St. Clair of Lee in the county of Kent. Never in my life had I seen such a sight. The man's face peeled off under the sponge like the bark from a tree. Gone was the coarse brown tint. Gone, too, was the horrid scar which had seamed it across, and the twisted lip which had given the repulsive sneer to the face. A twitch brought away tangled red hair, and there, sitting upon the bed, was a pale, sad-faced, refined-looking man, black-haired and smooth-skinned, rubbing his eyes and staring about him sleepily in bewilderment. Then, suddenly realizing the exposure, he broke into a scream and threw himself down with his face into the pillow. Great heavens, cried the inspector. It is indeed the missing man. I know him from the photograph. The prisoner turned with the reckless air of a man who abandons himself to his destiny. Be it so, said he. And pray, what am I charged with? With making away with Mr. Neville St. Oh, come. You can't be charged with that unless they make a case of attempted suicide of it, said the inspector with a grin. Well, I have been 27 years in the force, but this really takes the cake. If I am Mr. Neville St. Clair, then it is obvious no crime has been committed, and therefore I am illegally detained. No crime, but a very great error has been committed, said Holmes. You would have done better to have trusted your wife. It was not the wife. It was the children, groaned the prisoner. God help me. I would not have them ashamed of their father. My God, what an exposure. What can I do? Sherlock Holmes sat down beside him on the couch and patted him kindly on the shoulder. If you leave it to a court of law to clear the matter up, said he, of course you can hardly avoid publicity. On the other hand, if you convince the police authorities that there is no possible case against you, I do not know that there is any reason that the details should find their way into the papers. Inspector Bradstreet would, I am sure, make notes upon anything which you might tell us and submit it to the proper authorities. The case would then never go into court at all. God bless you, cried the prisoner passionately. I would have endured imprisonment, aye, even execution, rather than have my miserable secret left as a blot to my children. You are the first who have ever heard my story. My father was a schoolmaster in Chesterfield, where I received an excellent education. I traveled in my youth, took to the stage, and finally became a reporter on an evening paper in London. One day, my editor wished to have a series of articles upon begging in the metropolis, and I volunteered to supply them. There was the point from which all my adventures started. It was only by trying begging as an amateur that I could get the facts on which to base my articles. When an actor, I had, of course, learned all the secrets of making up and had been famous in the green room for my skill. I took now advantage of my attainments. I painted my face, and to make myself as pitiable as possible, I made a good scar and fixed one side of my lip in a twist by the aid of a small slip of flesh-colored plaster. Then, with a red head of hair and an appropriate dress, I took my station in the business part of the city, ostensibly as a match seller, but really as a beggar. For 7 hours I plied my trade, and when I returned home in the evening, I found, to my surprise, that I had received no less than 26 shillings 4 pence. I wrote my articles and thought little more of the matter until some time later. I backed a bill for a friend and had a writ served upon me for £25. I was at my wit's end where to get the money, but a sudden idea occurred to me. I begged a fortnight's grace from the creditor, asked a holiday from my employers, and spent the time in begging in the city under my disguise. In 10 days, I had the money and had paid the debt. Well, you can imagine how hard it was to settle down to arduous work at £2 a week when I knew that I could earn as much in a day by smearing my face with a little paint, laying my cap on the ground, and sitting still. It was a long fight between my pride and the money, but the dollars won at last. And I threw up reporting and sat day after day in the corner which I had first chosen, inspiring pity by my ghastly face and filling my pockets with coppers. Only one man knew my secret. He was the keeper of a low den in which I used to lodge in Swandam Lane, where I could every morning emerge as a squalid beggar and in the evening transform myself into a well-dressed man about town. This fellow, Lasker, was well paid by me for his rooms, so that I knew that my secret was safe in his possession. Well, very soon I found that I was saving considerable sums of money. I do not mean that any beggar in the streets of London could earn £700 a year, which is less than my average takings, but I had exceptional advantages in my power of making up and also in a facility of repartee, which improved by practice and made me quite a recognized character in the city. All day, a stream of pennies, varied by silver, poured in upon me, and it was a very bad day in which I failed to take £2. As I grew richer, I grew more ambitious, took a house in the country, and eventually married, without anyone having any suspicion as to my real occupation. My dear wife knew that I had business in the city. She little knew what. Last Monday, I had finished for the day and was dressing in my room above the opium den when I looked out of my window and saw, to my horror and astonishment, that my wife was standing in the street with her eyes fixed full upon me. I gave a cry of surprise, threw up my arms to cover my face, and rushing to my confidant, the Lasker, entreated him to prevent anyone from coming up to me. I heard her voice downstairs, but I knew that she could not ascend. Swiftly, I threw off my clothes, pulled on those of a beggar, and put on my pigments and wig. Even a wife's eyes could not pierce so complete a disguise. But then it occurred to me that there might be a search in the room, and that the clothes might betray me. I threw open the windows, reopening by my violence a small cut which I had inflicted upon myself in the bedroom that morning. Then I seized my coat, which was weighted by the coppers which I had transferred it to from my leather bag in which I carried my takings. I hurled it out of the window, and it disappeared into the Thames. The other clothes would have followed, but at that moment there was a rush of constables up the stair. And a few minutes later I found, rather I confess to my relief, that instead of being identified as Mr. Neville St. Clair, I was arrested as his murderer. I do not know that there is anything else for me to explain. I was determined to preserve my disguise as long as possible, and hence my preference for a dirty face. Knowing that my wife would be terribly anxious, I slipped off my ring and confided it to the Lascar at a moment when no constable was watching me, together with a hurried scrawl that she need have no fear. "That note only reached her yesterday," said Holmes. "Good God, what a week she must have passed." "The police have watched this Lascar," said Inspector Bradstreet, "and I can quite understand that he might find it difficult to post a letter unobserved. Probably he handed it to some sailor customer of his who had forgot all about it for some days." "That was it," said Holmes, nodding approvingly. "I have no doubt of it. But have you never been prosecuted for begging?" "Many times. But what was the fine to me?" "It must stop here, however," said Bradstreet. "If the police are to hush this up, there must be no more of you Boone." "I have sworn it by the most solemn oath which a man can take." "In that case, I think it is probable that no further steps may be taken. But if you are found out, that again all must come out. I am sure, Mr. Holmes, that we are very much indebted to you for having cleared the matter up. I wish I knew how you reached your results." "I reached this one by sitting upon 5 pillows and consuming an ounce of shag. I think, Watson, that if we drive to Baker Street, we shall be just in time for breakfast." The end of The Man with the Twisted Lip. Welcome back, and my compliments of the Christmas season to you all. It is a bitterly cold night out there, and it reminds me of a Christmas a few years ago when I was presented with a very singular Christmas goose and an equally singular and mysterious case. The game's afoot. The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. I had called upon my friend Sherlock Holmes upon the second morning after Christmas with the intention of wishing him the compliments of the season. He was lounging upon the sofa in a purple dressing gown, a pipe rack within reach upon the right, and a pile of crumpled morning papers, evidently newly studied, near at hand. Beside the couch was a wooden chair, and on the angle of the back hung a very seedy and disreputable hard felt hat, much the worse for wear and cracked in several places. A lens and a forceps lying upon the seat of the chair suggested that the hat had been suspended in this manner for the purpose of examination. "You are engaged," said I. "Perhaps I interrupt you." "Not at all. I am glad to have a friend with whom I can discuss my results. The matter is a perfectly trivial one." He jerked his thumb in the direction of the old hat. "But there are points in connection with it which are not entirely devoid of interest and even of instruction." I seated myself in his armchair and warmed my hands before his crackling fire, for a sharp frost had set in, and the windows were thick with the ice crystals. "I suppose," I remarked, "that homely as it looks, this thing has some deadly mystery linked to it, that it is the clue which will guide you in the solution of some mystery and the punishment of some crime." "No, "No, no crime," said Sherlock Holmes, laughing. "Only one of those whimsical little incidents which will happen when you have 4 million human beings all jostling each other within the space of a few square miles. Amid the action and reaction of so dense a swarm of humanity, every possible combination of event may be expected to take place, and many a little problem will be presented which may be striking and bizarre without being criminal. We already have had experience of such. So much so," I remarked, "that of the last 6 cases which I have added to my notes, 3 have been entirely free of any legal crime." "Precisely. You allude to my attempt to recover the Irene Adler papers, to the singular case of Miss Mary Sutherland, and to the adventure of the man with the twisted lip. Well, I have no doubt that this small matter will fall into the same innocent category. You know Peterson, the commissionaire?" "Yes." "It is to him that this trophy belongs." "It is his hat?" No. He found it. Its owner is unknown. I beg that you will examine it not as a battered billycock, but as an intellectual problem. And first, as to how it came here, it arrived upon Christmas morning in company with a good fat goose, which is, I have no doubt, roasting at this moment in front of Peterson's fire. The facts are these. About 4 o'clock on Christmas morning, Peterson, who, as you know, is a very honest fellow, was returning from some small jollification and was making his way home down Tottenham Court Road. In front of him, he saw in the gaslight a tallish man walking with a slight stagger and carrying a white goose slung over his shoulder. As he reached the corner of Goodge Street, a row broke out between this stranger and a little knot of roughs. One of the latter knocked off the man's hat, on which he raised his stick to defend himself, and swinging it over to his head, smashed the shop window behind him. Peterson had rushed forward to protect the stranger from his assailants, but the man, shocked at having broken the window and seeing an official-looking person bearing down upon him, dropped his goose, took to his heels, and vanished amid the labyrinth of small streets which lie at the back of Tottenham Court Road. The roughs had also fled at the appearance of Peterson, so that he was left in possession of the field of battle and also of the spoils of victory in the shape of this battered hat and a most unimpeachable Christmas goose, which surely he restored to their owner. My dear fellow, there lies the problem. It is true that Mrs. Henry Baker was printed upon a small card which was tied to the bird's left leg. And it is also true that the initials HB are legible upon the lining of this hat. But as there are some thousands of Bakers and some hundreds of Henry Bakers in this city of ours, it is not an easy matter to restore lost property to any one of them. What then did Peterson do? He brought round both hat and goose to me on Christmas morning, knowing that even the smallest problems are of interest to me. The goose we retained until this morning, when there were signs that, in spite of the frost, it would be well that it should be eaten without unnecessary delay. Its finder has carried it off, therefore, to fulfill the ultimate destiny of a goose, while I continue to retain the hat of the unknown gentleman who lost his Christmas dinner. Did he not advertise? No. Then what clue could you have as to his identity? Only as much as we can deduce. From his hat? Precisely. But you are joking. What can you gather from this old battered felt? Here is my lens. You know my methods. What can you gather yourself as to the individuality of the man who has worn this article? I took the battered object in my hands and turned it over rather ruefully. It was a very ordinary black felt hat of the usual round shape, hard and much the worse for wear. The lining had been of red silk, but was a good deal discolored. There was no maker's name, but as Holmes had remarked, the initials HB were scrawled upon one side. It was pierced in the brim for a hat securer, but the elastic was missing. For the rest, it was cracked, exceedingly dusty and spotted in several places, although there seemed to have been some attempt to hide the discolored patches by smearing them with ink. "I can see nothing," said I, handing it back to my friend. "On the contrary, Watson, you can see everything. You fail, however, to reason from what you see. You are too timid in drawing your inferences." "Then pray tell me what it is that you can infer from this hat." He picked it up and gazed at it in the peculiar introspective fashion which was characteristic of him. "It is perhaps less suggestive than it might have been," he remarked, "and yet there are a few inferences which are very distinct, and a few others which represent at least a strong balance of probability. That the man was highly intellectual is, of course, obvious upon the face of it, and also that he was fairly well-to-do within the last 3 years, although he has now fallen upon evil days. He had foresight, but has less now than formerly, pointing to a moral retrogression, which, when taken with the decline of his fortunes, seems to indicate some evil influence, probably drink, at work upon him. This may also account for the obvious fact that his wife has ceased to love him. My dear Holmes, he has, however, retained some degree of self-respect," he continued, disregarding my remonstrance. "He is a man who leads a sedentary life, goes out little, is out of training entirely, is middle-aged, has grizzled hair which he's had recently cut within the last few days, and which he anoints with lime cream. These are the more patent facts which are to be deduced from his hat. Also, by the way, that it is extremely improbable that he has gas laid on in his house." "You are certainly joking, Holmes." "Not in the least. Is it possible that even now, when I give you these results, you are unable to see how they are attained?" "I have no doubt that I am very stupid, but I must confess that I am unable to follow you. For example, how did you deduce that this man was intellectual?" Just a moment. For answer, Holmes clapped the hat upon his head, and went over his forehead and rested upon his nose. "It is a question of cubic capacity. A man with so large a brain must have something in it." The decline of his fortunes, then? This hat is 3 years old. These flat brims curled up at the edge were in fashion then. It is a hat of the very best quality. Look at the band of ribbed silk and the excellent lining. If this man could afford to buy so expensive a hat 3 years ago, and has had no hat since, then he has assuredly gone down in the world. Well, that is clear enough, but how about the foresight and the moral retrogression? Sherlock Holmes laughed. "Here is the foresight," said he, putting his finger upon the little disc and loop of the hat securer. "They are never sold upon hats. If this man ordered one, it is a sign of a certain amount of foresight, since he went out of his way to take this precaution against the wind. But since we see that he has broken the elastic and has not troubled to replace it, it is obvious that he has less foresight now than formerly, which is a distinct proof of a weakening nature. On the other hand, he has endeavored to conceal some of these stains upon the felt by daubing them with ink, which is a sign that he has not entirely lost his self-respect. Your reasoning is certainly plausible. The further points, that he is middle-aged, that his hair is grizzled, that it is recently cut, and that he uses lime cream, are all to be gathered from a close examination of the lower part of the lining. The lens discloses a large number of hair ends, clean cut by the scissors of the barber. They all appear to be adhesive, and there is a distinct odor of lime cream. This dust, you will observe, is not the gritty gray dust of the street, but the fluffy brown dust of the house, showing that it has been hung up indoors most of the time. While the marks of moisture upon the inside are proof positive that the wearer perspired very freely and could therefore hardly be in the best of training. But his wife, you said that she had ceased to love him. This hat has not been brushed for weeks. When I see you, my dear Watson, with a week's accumulation of dust upon your hat, and when your wife lets you go out of the house in such a fashion, I shall fear that you are also been unfortunate enough to lose your wife's affections. But he might be a bachelor. Nay, he was bringing home the goose as a peace offering to his wife. Remember the card upon the leg. You have an answer to everything. But how on earth do you deduce that the gas is not laid on in his house? One tallow stain, maybe two, might be by chance. But when I see no less than 5, I think there can be little doubt that the individual must be brought into frequent contact with burning tallow. Walks upstairs at night with his hat in one hand and a guttering candle in another. Anyhow, he never got tallow stains from a gas jet. Are you satisfied? Well, it is very ingenious, said I, laughing. But since, as you said now, there has been no crime committed and no harm done save the loss of a goose, all this seems to be rather a waste of energy. Sherlock Holmes had opened his mouth to reply when the door flew open and Peterson, the commissionaire, rushed into the apartment with flushed cheeks and the face of a man who is dazed with astonishment. The goose, Mr. Holmes! The goose, sir! Eh? What of it then? Has it returned to life and fluttered off through the kitchen window? Holmes twisted himself around to the sofa to get a fairer view of the man's excited face. See here, sir. See what my wife found in its crop. He held out his hand and displayed upon the center of the palm a brilliantly scintillating blue stone, rather smaller than a bean in size, but of such purity and radiance that it twinkled like an electric point in the dark hollow of his hand. Sherlock Holmes sat up with a whistle. Whew. A poor whistle. By Jove, Peterson, said he, this is a treasure trove indeed. I suppose you know what you've got. A diamond, sir? A precious stone? It cuts glass like it were putty. It's more than a precious stone. It is the precious stone. Not the Countess of Morcar's blue carbuncle, I ejaculated. Precisely so. I ought to know its size and shape, seeing that I have read the advertisement about it in the Time every day lately. It is absolutely unique, and its value can only be conjectured. But the reward offered of £1,000 is certainly not within a 20th part of its market value. £1,000! Great Lord of mercy! The commissioner plumped down into a chair and stared from one to the other of us. That is the reward. And I have reason to know that there are sentimental considerations which would induce the Countess to part with half her fortune if she could retain the gem. It was lost, if I remember right, at the Hotel Cosmopolitan, I remarked. Precisely so, on December 22nd, just 5 days ago, John Horner, a plumber, was accused of having abstracted it from the lady's jewel case. The evidence against him was so strong that the case has been referred to the assizes. I have some of the matter of the account somewhere here. He rummaged amid his newspapers, looking over dates, until at last he found one, doubled it over, and read the following paragraph. Hotel Cosmopolitan jewel robbery. John Horner, 26, plumber, was brought up upon charge of having, upon the 22nd, abstracted from the jewel case of the Countess of Morcar the valuable gem known as the blue carbuncle. James Ryder, upper attendant at the hotel, gave his evidence to the effect that he had shown Horner up to the dressing room of the Countess of Morcar upon the day of the robbery in order that he might solder the second grate which was loose. He had remained with Horner some little time, but had finally been called away. On returning, he found that Horner had disappeared, that the bureau had been forced open, and that the small morocco casket in which, as it was afterwards transpired, the Countess was accustomed to keeping her gem, was lying empty upon the dressing table. Ryder instantly gave the alarm, and Horner was arrested that same evening, but the stone could not be found upon him or in his rooms. Catherine Cusack, maid to the Countess, deposed to having heard Ryder's cry of dismay on discovering the robbery and to having rushed into the room where she found matters as described by the last witness. Inspector Bradstreet, B Division, gave evidence as to the arrest of Horner, who struggled frantically and protested his innocence in the strongest terms. Evidence of a previous conviction for robbery having been given against the prisoner, the magistrate refused to deal summarily with the offense, but referred it to the assizes. Horner, who had shown signs of intense emotion during the proceedings, fainted away at the conclusion and was carried out of court. So much for the police court, said Holmes thoughtfully, tossing aside the paper. The question for us now to solve is the sequence of events leading from a rifled jewel case at one end to the crop of a goose in Tottenham Court Road at the other. You see, Watson, our little deductions have suddenly assumed a much more important and less innocent aspect. Here is the stone. The stone came from the goose, and the goose came from Mr. Henry Baker, the gentleman with the bad hat and all the other little characteristics with which I have bored you. So now we must set ourselves very seriously to finding this gentleman and ascertaining what part he has played in this little mystery. To do this, we must try the simplest methods first, and these lie undoubtedly in an advertisement in all the evening papers. If this fail, I shall have recourse to other methods. What will you say? Give me a pencil and that slip of paper. Now then, found at the corner of Goodge Street, a goose and a black felt hat. Mr. Henry Baker can have the same by applying at 6:30 this evening at 221B Baker Street. That is clear and concise. Yes, but will he see it? Well, he is sure to keep an eye on the paper, since to a poor man the loss was a heavy one. He was clearly so scared by his mischance in breaking the window and by the approach of Peterson that he thought of nothing but flight. But since then, he must have bitterly regretted the impulse which caused him to drop his bird. Then again, the introduction of his name will cause him to see it, for everyone who knows him will direct his attention to it. Here you are, Peterson. Run down to the advertising agency and have this put in the evening papers. In which, sir? Oh, in the Globe, Star, Pall Mall, St. James, Evening News, Standard, Echo, and any other that occur to you. Very well, sir. And the stone? Ah, yes. I shall keep the stone. Thank you. And I say, Peterson, just buy a goose on your way back and leave it here with me, for we must have one to give to this gentleman in place of the one which your family is now devouring. When the commissioner had gone, Holmes took up the stone and held it against the light. It's a bonny thing, he said. Just see how it glints and sparkles. Of course, it is a nucleus and focus of crime. Every good stone is. They are the devil's pet baits. In the larger and older jewels, every facet may stand for a bloody deed. The stone is not yet 20 years old. It was found in the banks of the Amoy River in southern China and is remarkable for having all the characteristics of the carbuncle, save that it is blue in shade instead of ruby red. In spite of its youth, it has already a sinister history. There have been 2 murders, a vitriol throwing, a suicide, and several robberies brought about for this 40-grain weight of crystallized charcoal. Who would think that so pretty a toy would be the purveyor to the gallows and to the prison? I'll lock it up in my strong box now and drop a line to the Countess to say that we have it. Do you think that this man Horner is innocent? I cannot tell. Well then, do you imagine that this other one, Henry Baker, had anything to do with the matter? It is, I think, much more likely that Henry Baker is an absolutely innocent man who had no idea that the bird that he was carrying was of considerable more value than if it were made of solid gold. That, however, I shall determine by a very simple test if we have an answer to our advertisement. And you can do nothing until then? Nothing. In that case, I shall continue my professional round, but I shall come back in the evening at the hour you have mentioned, for I should like to see the solution of so tangled a business. Very glad to see you. I dine at 7. There is a woodcock, I believe. By the way, in view of recent occurrences, perhaps I ought to ask Mrs. Hudson to examine its crop. I had been delayed at a case, and it was a little after 6:30 when I found myself in Baker Street once more. As I approached the house, I saw a tall man in a Scotch bonnet with a coat which was buttoned up to his chin, waiting outside in the bright semicircle which was thrown from the fanlight. Just as I arrived, the doors opened, and we were shown up together to Holmes's room. "Mr. Henry Baker, I believe," said he, rising from his armchair and greeting his visitor with the easy air of geniality which he could so readily assume. "Pray take this chair by the fire, Mr. Baker. It is a cold night, and I observe that your circulation is more adapted for summer than for winter." "Ah, Watson, you've come at just the right time. Is that your hat, Mr. Baker?" "Yes, sir. That is undoubtedly my hat." He was a large man with rounded shoulders, a massive head, and a broad, intelligent face, sloping down to a pointed beard of grizzled brown. A touch of red in his nose and cheeks, with a slight tremor of his extended hand, recalled Holmes' surmises as to his habits. His rusty black frock coat was buttoned right up in front, with the collar turned up, and his lank wrists protruded from his sleeves, without a sign of cuff or shirt. He spoke in a slow, staccato fashion, choosing his words with care, and gave the impression generally of a man of learning and letters who has had ill usage at the hands of fortune. "We have retained these things for some days," said Holmes, "because we expected to see an advertisement from you giving your address. I am at a loss as to know why you did not advertise." Our visitor gave a rather shamefaced laugh. "Shillings have not been so plentiful with me as they once were," he remarked. "I had no doubt that the gang of roughs who assaulted me had carried off both my hat and the bird. I did not care to spend more money in a hopeless attempt at recovering them." "Very naturally. By the way, about the bird, we were compelled to eat it." "To eat it?" Our visitor half rose from his chair in his excitement. "Yes, it would have been no use to anyone had we not done so. But I presume that this other goose upon the sideboard, which is about the same weight and perfectly fresh, will answer your purpose equally well." "Oh, certainly, certainly," answered Mr. Baker with a sigh of relief. "Of course, we have the feathers, legs, crop, and so on of your bird. So if you wish..." The man burst into a hearty laugh. "They might be useful to me as relics of my adventure," said he. "But beyond that, I can hardly see what use the disjecta membra of my late acquaintance are going to be to me. No, sir. I think that with your permission, I will contain my attention to the excellent bird which I perceive upon the sideboard." Sherlock Holmes glanced sharply across at me with a slight shrug of his shoulders. "There is your hat, then, and there your bird. By the way, would it bore you to tell me where you got the other one from? I am somewhat of a fowl fancier, and I've seldom seen a better-grown goose." "Certainly, sir," said Baker, who had risen and tucked his newly gained property under his arm. "There are a few of us who frequent the Alpha Inn near the museum. We are to be found in a museum itself during the day, you understand. This year, our good host, Windigate by name, instituted a goose club by which, on consideration of some few pence every week, we were each to receive a bird at Christmas. My pence were duly paid, and the rest is familiar to you. I am much indebted to you, sir, for a Scotch bonnet is fitted neither to my years nor to my gravity. With a comical pomposity of manner, he bowed solemnly to both of us and strode off upon his way. So much for Mr. Henry Baker, said Holmes when he had closed the door behind him. It is quite certain that he knows nothing whatever about the matter. Are you hungry, Watson? Not particularly. Then I suggest that we turn our dinner into a supper and follow up this clue while it is still hot, by all means. It was a bitter night, so we drew on our ulsters and wrapped cravats about our throats. Outside, the stars were shining coldly in a cloudless sky, and the breath of the passers-by blew out into smoke like so many pistol shots. Our footfalls rang out crisply and loudly as we swung through the doctor's quarters, Wimpole Street, Harley Street, and so through Wigmore Street into Oxford Street. In a quarter of an hour, we were in the Bloomsbury at the Alpha Inn, which is a small public house at the corner of one of the streets which runs down into Holborn. Holmes pushed open the door of the private bar and ordered two glasses of beer, from the ruddy-faced, white-aproned landlord. Your beer should be excellent if it is good as your geese, said he. My geese? The man seemed surprised. Yes, I was speaking only half an hour ago with Mr. Henry Baker, who was a member of your goose club. Oh, yes, I see, sir, but you see, them's not our geese. Indeed. Whose then? Well, I got the 2 dozen from a salesman in Covent Garden. Indeed, I know some of them. Which was it? Breckenridge is his name. I don't know him. Well, here's your good health, landlord, and prosperity to your house. Good night. Now for Mr. Breckenridge, he continued, buttoning up his coat as we came out into the frosty air. Remember, Watson, that although we have something so homely as a goose at one end of this chain, we have at the other a man who will certainly get 7 years penal servitude unless we can establish his innocence. It is possible that our inquiry may but confirm his guilt, but in any case, we have a line of investigation which has been missed by the police, and which a singular chance has placed in our hands. Let us follow it out to the bitter end, faces to the south, and quick march. We passed across Holborn, down Endell Street, and so through a zigzag of slums to Covent Garden Market. One of the largest stalls bore the name of Breckenridge upon it, and the proprietor, a horsey-looking man with a sharp face and trim side whiskers, was helping a boy to put up the shutters. Good evening. It's a cold night. The salesman nodded and shot a questioning glance at my companion. Sold out of geese, I see, said Holmes, pointing at the bare slabs of marble. Let you have 500 tomorrow morning. That's no good. Well, there are some in the stall with the gas flare. Ah, but I was recommended to you. Who by? The landlord of the Alpha. Oh, yes, I sent him a couple of dozen. Fine birds they were, too. Now, where did you get those from? To my surprise, the question provoked a burst of anger from the salesman. Now then, mister, said he, with his head cocked and his arms akimbo, what are you driving at? Let's have it straight now. It's straight enough. I should like to know who sold you the geese which you supplied to the Alpha. Well, then, I shan't tell you so now. Oh, it is a matter of no importance, but I don't know why you should be so warm over such a trifle. Warm? You'd be warm, maybe, if you were as pestered as I am. When I pay good money for a good article, there should be an end of the business. But it's where are the geese? And who do you sell the geese to? And what will you take for the geese? One would think they were the only geese in the world to pay the fuss that is made over them. Well, I have no connection with other people who have been making inquiries, said Holmes carelessly. If you won't tell us, the bet is off, that is all. But I'm always ready to back my opinion on a matter of fowls, and I have a fiver on it that the bird I ate is country bred. Well, then, you've lost your fiver, for it's town bread, snapped the salesman. It's nothing of the kind. I say it is. I don't believe it. Do you think you know more about fowls than I, who've handled them ever since I was a nipper? I tell you, all those birds that went to the alpha were town bred. You'll never persuade me to believe that. Will you bet, then? It's merely taking your money, for I know that I am right. But I'll have a sovereign on with you just to teach you not to be obstinate. The salesman chuckled grimly. Bring me the books, Bill, said he. The small boy brought round a small, thin volume and a great, greasy-backed one, laying them out together under the hanging lamp. Now then, Mr. Cocksure, said the salesman, I thought I was out of geese, but before I finish, you'll find that there's still one left in my shop. You see this little book? Well, that's the list of the folk from whom I buy, do you see? Well, then, here on this page are the country folk, and the numbers after the name are where their accounts are in the big ledger. Now then, you see this other page in red ink? Well, that is a list of my town suppliers. Now look at that third name. Just read it out to me. Mrs. Oakshott, 117 Brixton Road, 249, read Holmes. Quite so. Now turn that up in the ledger. Holmes turned to the page indicated. Here you are, Mrs. Oakshott, 117 Brixton Road, egg and poultry supplier. Now then, what's the last entry? December 22nd, 24 geese at 7 shillings 6 pence. Quite so. There you are. And underneath, sold to Mr. Windigate of the Alpha at 12 shillings. What have you to say now? Sherlock Holmes looked deeply chagrined. He drew a sovereign from his pocket and threw it down upon the slab, turning away with the air of a man whose disgust is too deep for words. A few yards off, he stopped under a lamppost and laughed in the hearty, noiseless fashion which was peculiar to him. When you see a man with whiskers of that cut and a pink un protruding out of his pocket, you can always draw him by a bet. I dare say that if I put £100 down in front of him, that man would not have given me such complete information as was drawn from him by the idea that he was doing me on a wager. Well, Watson, we are, I fancy, nearing the end of our quest, and the only point which remains to be determined is whether we should go on to this Mrs. Oakshott tonight or whether we should reserve it for tomorrow. It is clear from what that surly fellow said that there are others besides ourselves who are anxious about the matter, and his remarks were suddenly cut short by a loud hubbub which broke out from the stall which we had just left. Turning around, we saw a little rat-faced fellow standing in the center of the circle of light which was thrown by the swinging lamp, while Breckenridge, the salesman, framed in the door of his stall, was shaking his fist fiercely at the cringing figure. I've had enough of you and your geese, he shouted. I wish you were all the devil together. If you come pestering me with any more, I'll set the dog upon you. You bring Mrs. Oakshott here, and I'll answer her. But what have I to do with you? Did I buy the geese off you? No. No, but one of them was mine all the same, whined the little man. Well then, ask Mrs. Oakshott for it. She told me to ask you. Well, you can ask the King of Prussia for all I care. I've had enough of it. Get out of this. He rushed fiercely forward, and the inquirer flitted away into the darkness. Ha! This may save us a trip to Brixton Road, whispered Holmes. Come with me, and we will see what is to be made of this fellow. Striding through the scattered knots of people who lounged round the flaring stalls, my companion speedily overtook the little man and touched him upon the shoulder. He sprang round, and I could see in the gaslight that every vestige of color had been driven from his face. Who are you, then? What do you want? He asked in a quavering voice. You will excuse me, said Holmes blandly, but I could not help overhearing the questions which you put to the salesman just now. I think that I could be of assistance to you. You? Who are you? How could you know anything of the matter? My name is Sherlock Holmes, and it is my business to know what other people don't know. But you can know nothing of this. Excuse me, I know everything of it. You are endeavoring to trace some geese which were sold by Mrs. Oakshott of Brixton Road to a salesman named Breckenridge, by him in turn to Mr. Wingate of the Alpha, and by him to his club, of which Mr. Henry Baker is a member. "Oh, sir, you are the very man whom I have longed to meet," cried the little fellow, with outstretched hands and quivering fingers. "I can hardly explain to you how interested I am in this matter." Sherlock Holmes hailed a four-wheeler which was passing. "In that case, we had better discuss it in a cozy room rather than in this windswept marketplace," said he. "But pray, tell me, before we go further, who is it that I have the pleasure of assisting?" The man hesitated for an instant. "My name is John Robinson," he answered with a sidelong glance. No, your real name. It is always awkward doing business with aliases." A flush sprang to the white cheeks of the stranger. "Well then," said he, "my real name is James Ryder." "Precisely so. Head attendant at the Hotel Cosmopolitan. Pray step into the cab, and I shall soon be able to tell you everything which you would wish to know." The little man stood glancing from one to the other of us with half-frightened, half-hopeful eyes, as one who is not sure whether he is on the verge of a windfall or a catastrophe. Then he stepped into the cab, and in half an hour we were back in the sitting room at Baker Street. Nothing had been said during our drive, but the high, thin breathing of our new companion and the claspings and unclaspings of his hands spoke of the nervous tension within him. "Here we are," said Holmes cheerily as we entered Baker Street. "The fire looks very seasonable in this weather. You look cold, Mr. Ryder. Pray take the basket chair. I will just put on my slippers before we settle this little matter of yours. Now then, you want to know what became of those geese?" "Yes, sir." "Or rather, I fancy, of that goose. It was one bird, I imagine, in which you were interested, white with a black bar across the tail." Ryder quivered with emotion. "Oh, sir," he cried, "can you tell me where it went?" "It came here." "Here?" "Yes, and a most remarkable bird it proved. I don't wonder that you should take an interest in it. It laid an egg after it was dead. The bonniest, brightest little blue egg that ever was seen. I have it here in my museum." Our visitor staggered to his feet and clutched the mantelpiece with his right hand. Holmes held the blue carbuncle, which shone out like a star with a cold, brilliant, many-pointed radiance. Ryder stood glaring with drawn face, uncertain whether to claim it or disown it. "The game's up, Ryder," said Holmes quietly. "Hold up, man, or you'll be into the fire. Give him an arm back into his chair, Watson. He's not got blood enough to go in for felony with impunity. Give him a dash of brandy. So now he looks a little more human. What a shrimp it is, to be sure." For a moment he had staggered and nearly fallen, but the brandy brought a vestige of color into his cheeks, and he sat staring with frightened eyes at his accuser. "I have most every link in my hands and all the proofs which I could possibly need, so there's very little which you need tell me. Still, that little may as well be cleared up to make the case complete. You had heard, Ryder, of this blue stone of the Countess of Morcar's?" "It was Catherine Cusack who told me of it," said he in a crackling voice. "I see. Her ladyship's waiting maid. Well, the temptation of sudden wealth so easily acquired was too much for you. It seems to me, Ryder, that there's the making of a very pretty villain in you. You knew that this man Horner, the plumber, had been concerned in some such affair before, and that suspicion would more readily rest upon him. What did you do then? You made some small job in my lady's room, you and your confederate Cusack, and you managed that he should be the man sent for. Then, when he left, you rifled the jewel case, raised the alarm, and had this unfortunate man arrested. You then, Ryder threw himself down suddenly upon the rug and clutched at my companion's knees. 'For God's sake, have mercy!' he shrieked. 'Think of my father, of my mother. It would break their hearts. I never went wrong before, I never will again, I swear it. I swear it on the Bible. Oh, don't bring it to court, for God's sakes, don't. Get back into your chair. It is very easy to cringe and crawl now, but you thought little of this poor Horner in the dock for a crime of which he knew nothing. I will fly, Mr. Holmes. I will leave the country, sir. Then the charge against him must break down. We will talk about that. And now, let us hear a true account of the next act. How came the stone into the goose, and how came the goose into the open market? Tell us the truth, for there lies your only hope of safety. Ryder passed his tongue over his parched lips. I will tell you, sir, just as it happened, said he. When Horner had been arrested, it seemed to me that it would be best for me to get away with the stone at once. For I did not know at what one moment the police might not take it into their heads to search me in my room. There was no place about the hotel where it would be safe. I went out as if on some commission, and I made for my sister's house. She had married a man named Oakshott and lived in Brixton Road, where she fattened fowls for the market. All the way there, every man I met seemed to be a policeman or a detective, and for all that it was a cold night, the sweat was pouring off my face before I came to the Brixton Road. My sister asked me what was the matter and why I was so pale, but I told her that I'd been upset by the jewel robbery at the hotel. Then I went into the backyard and I smoked a pipe, and I wondered what would be the best to do. I had a friend once called Maudsley who went to the bad and has just been serving his time in Pentonville. One day he had met me and fell into talk about the ways of thieves and how they could get rid of what they stole. I knew that he would be true to me, for I knew one or two things about him. So I made up my mind to go right on to Kilburn, where he lived, and take him into my confidence. He would show me how to turn the stone into money, but how to get to him in safety. I thought of the agonies I had gone through on coming from the hotel. I might at any moment be seized and searched, and there would be the stone in my waistcoat pocket. I was leaning against the wall at the time and looking at the geese, which were waddling about around my feet, and suddenly an idea came into my head, which showed me how I could beat the best detective that ever lived. My sister had told me some weeks before that I might have the pick of her geese for a Christmas present, and I knew she was always as good as her word. I would take my goose now, and in it I would carry my stone to Kilburn. There was a little shed in the yard, and behind this I drove one of the birds, a fine big one with a barred tail. I caught it, and prying its bill open, I thrust it down its gullet and down into the crop. But the creature flapped and struggled, and out came my sister to know what was the matter. As I turned to speak to her, the brute broke loose and fluttered off among the others. Whatever were you doing with that bird, Jem? Said she. Well, said I, you said you'd give me one for Christmas, and I was feeling which one was the fattest. Oh, says she, we've set yours aside for you. Jem's bird, we call it. It's the big white one over yonder. There's 26 of them, which makes one for you and one for us and 2 dozen for the market. Thank you, Maggie, says I, but if it's all the same to you, I'd rather have that one I was handling just now. The other is a good 3 pounds heavier, said she, and we fattened it expressly for you. Never mind, I'll have the other, and I'll take it now, said I. Oh, just as you like, she said, a little huffed. Which is it you want, then? That white one with the barred tail, right in the middle of the flock. Oh, very well, kill it and take it with you. Well, I did what you said, Mr. Holmes, and I carried the bird all the way to Kilburn. I told my pal what I had done, for he was a man who was easy to tell a thing like that, too. He laughed until he choked, and we got a knife and opened the goose. My heart turned to water, for there was no sign of the stone, and I knew that some terrible mistake had occurred. I left the bird, rushed back to my sister's, and hurried into the backyard. There was not a bird to be seen there. Where are all they, Maggie? I cried. Gone to the dealers, Jem. Which dealers? Breckenridge of Covent Gardens. But was there another with a barred tail? I asked. The same as the one I chose. Yes, Jem. There were two bar-tailed ones, and I could never tell the difference. Well then, of course, I saw it all, and I ran off as hard as my feet would carry me to this man Breckenridge, but he had sold a lot at once, and not one word would he tell me as to where they had gone. You heard him yourself tonight. Well, he has always answered me like that. My sister thinks I'm going mad. Sometimes I think I am myself. And now I am myself a branded thief without ever having touched the wealth for which I sold my character. God help me. God help me. He burst into convulsive sobbing with his face buried in his hands. There was a long silence, broken only by his heavy breathing and by the measured tapping of Sherlock Holmes's fingers upon the edge of the table. Then my friend rose and threw open the door. "Get out," said he. "What, sir?" "Oh, heaven bless you!" No more words. Get out. And no more words were needed. There was a rush, a clatter upon the stairs, the bang of a door, and the crisp rattle of running footfalls from the street. After all, Watson, I am not retained by the police to supply their deficiencies. If Horror were in danger, it would be another matter. But this fellow will not appear against him, and the case must collapse. I suppose that I am commuting a felony, but it is just possible that I am saving a soul. This fellow will not go wrong again. He is too terribly frightened. Send him to jail now, and you make him a jailbird for life. Besides, it is the season of forgiveness. Chance has put in our way a most singular and whimsical problem, and its solution is its own reward. If you will have the goodness to touch the bell for supper, Doctor, we will begin another investigation in which also a bird will be the chief feature. The End of the Blue Carbuncle.